Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. This case begins on a quiet street in Elgin, Moray, Scotland. It's a school morning. Two children head out the door. By noon, their mother, Arlene Fraser, 33, fails to answer calls, doesn't show up where she's expected, and leaves no message. There is no emergency call, no neighbors reporting a struggle, no body. What detectives have at first is absence, and in no body investigations, absence is a data point. The initial response follows missing person protocol. Officers document the last reliable movements. Children to school, Arlene last seen at the home shortly after. A welfare check finds nothing that rises to a clear forensic alarm, no obvious signs of a violent event. Detectives begin with the basics. Confirm normal routines, lockdown times, and identify any gaps. They secure the residence, note the state of rooms, doors, and windows, and preserve what could later matter: prints, trace, impressions. Though there is no single item in plain sight that explains a sudden disappearance, the procedural work moves outward. Investigators canvass the immediate area for anyone who saw Arlene after the morning routine. They review bus stops, shop fronts, school perimeters, rural lanes that connect out of Elgin. They record negative findings, no confirmed sighting after a narrow morning window. They flag the silent indicators that often separate a voluntary walkout from a criminal event: banking activity, phone use, scheduled appointments. These stop cold on April 28, 1998. One detective notes later, the timeline aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. From the start, the inquiry keeps two tracks open: voluntary absence versus foul play. But the facts begin to lean. Arlene's responsibilities are consistent. Friends and family describe her as attentive to her kids and reachable. She doesn't vanish midday without notice. Investigators expand search sectors, fields, streams, and verges commonly used for concealment in rural areas, but still recover nothing that constitutes a scene. In towns like Elgin, disappearances aren't just mysteries. They unsettle the rhythm of a place. People lock doors earlier. Rumors run faster than lab results. With no body, the case depends on tight sequencing. Detectives build a minute-by-minute chart for the morning, looking for anyone with access, motive, or opportunity. They begin cataloging names connected to Arlene's daily life and household. Standard practice in a missing mother case. No conclusions are published. The working posture stays narrow: establish facts, preserve options, resist narrative drift. The house does not deliver the kind of decisive forensic signal seen in homicide scenes. That means the investigation must harvest smaller, less eloquent clues and hold them until a pattern forms. As day turns to night, Scotland's late spring light fades and the absence becomes harder to explain. There is still no body, no confirmed movement, and no message. That doesn't end an inquiry. It starts one. Evidence will need to come from what's left behind and what returns unexpectedly. For now, the file carries a simple, heavy label: missing person. The first 48 hours are a sorting exercise. What is noise? What is signal? In Elgin, Moray, the file on Arlene Fraser, 33, moves from a welfare check to a structured inquiry when the basics do not return. No verified sighting after the school run. No banking activity, no calls or messages, appointments missed without explanation. The absence is total, and totals matter. Detectives consolidate the morning window. They interview school staff, neighbors on the street, postal workers, delivery drivers, anyone with a regular route past the house. Statements are logged, time-stamped, and compared for overlap or contradiction. The house is re-entered with a tighter brief. Document doors, windows, entry points, and any object placement that suggests recent disturbance. There is no decisive trace that reads as a violent event. That does not end the inquiry. It changes the burden of proof. When a scene is quiet, the case depends on time, access, and behavior. Search sectors expand. Officers sweep verges, hedgerows, farm tracks, and burn lines that could conceal clothing or a handset. Canine units clear likely drop zones. Rural searches in Scotland are precise. Grid, flag, record, move. Nothing emerges that qualifies as a scene. Negative findings are recorded because they narrow options. A blank area today means resources are not wasted tomorrow. If you are watching this and thinking, or how can nothing be evidence? That is how these cases are built. A parent with 2 children does not vanish at midday and leave every measurable system silent unless something external acts upon that life. The inquiry team builds a baseline portrait. Friends and relatives give practical detail: who Arlene called when schedules changed, where she shopped, who held spare keys, which neighbors had permission to drop in. Officers confirm those keys. They check vehicles in the household and any regular contractors who might have access. Each name is plotted on a simple chart. Relation to Arlene, reason for access, location during the crucial hours. The goal is not drama, it is elimination. The fewer people with opportunity, the clearer the picture. Public communication is deliberate. Investigators release a controlled appeal. Time window, clothing, last seen if reliable, streets of interest, and a request for dash cam or home video. Limited in 1998, but still worth asking. Residents are urged to report anything that looked out of place that week. A vehicle idling near the house, a stranger walking a route that locals do not use. Tips are triaged. Most lead nowhere. A few require a second look. You will not hear those details yet because the standard is simple. Share only what the record can hold. Internally, the posture shifts. The working assumption becomes that Arlene was not in a position to authorize her own disappearance. The indicators that usually accompany a voluntary move, cash withdrawals, card swipes, calls to a confidant, are absent. Her responsibilities are active and recent. Her patterns stop on April 28, 1998, and do not resume. An investigator writes in a margin, "The data align too cleanly." Sometimes that was the problem. In communities like this, crimes do not just break a law, they tear at how people live: who walks to school, who leaves a light on, who looks out a window 5 seconds longer than usual. With the missing person posture exhausted, the inquiry introduces tighter controls. A smaller group within the team handles sensitive interviews and rechecks alibis offered in the first pass. When claims are time-based, I was on a route, I was with a customer. Detectives look for independent anchors, receipts, logs, third-party statements that were not coordinated. It is routine work, but in no-body cases, routine is how you find the seam. The aim is not to prove a theory, it is to remove what cannot be true until what remains must be faced. By the end of this phase, the file is heavier with negatives than positives. That is expected. You can measure reliability by how many options the evidence kills. There is still no body. There is still no single item you can hold up and say, this explains it. What the inquiry now has is a narrow window, a finite set of people with access, and a community that understands a line has been crossed even if it cannot point to where. The transition is complete. This is no longer a search that assumes return. It is an investigation that anticipates a crime. For you watching, here is the human piece that matters without overreaching. 2 children left for school and expected the day to run as usual. When law enforcement moves from concern to suspicion, it does so not to assign blame quickly, but to preserve what truth can still be recovered. The work from here is precise and at times uncomfortable. It has to be. The next step will test an odd development that enters the record 9 days after Arlene disappears. A development that changes the weight of the evidence and the direction of the case. By the second week, the case file adds context that matters. The husband, Nat Fraser, is already on the court's radar before April 28, 1998. He's on bail in a separate matter connected to domestic trouble. That detail does not decide a homicide. it sets boundaries. Bail conditions and prior complaints create a legal frame. Investigators must read carefully where he could be, who could vouch for him, and what his routine looked like during the narrow window when Arlene Fraser, 33, is last reliably placed at the home in Elgin, Moray. Detectives take the alibi the same way they take every claim, test it against independent anchors. A stated delivery route is mapped street by street. Times are checked against order sheets, phone logs, and third-party statements that were not coordinated. Store managers and customers are asked to identify exact windows, not estimates. Handwritten notes are scanned for corrections made after the fact. Vehicle movements are verified the old-fashioned way. Who saw the truck at which curb and when? If a stop claims 10 minutes, the team wants proof it wasn't 2. Access is the second track. Who had keys to the house? Who had reason to enter? Which friends or relatives had permission to drop in when schedules changed? Investigators confirm the number of keys issued, whether any were recently replaced, and whether a tradesperson held a temporary copy. They document locks and entry points without declaring a scene that doesn't exist. The point is simple. If someone had to be in that house between school drop-off and midday, the list of candidates must be short and defensible. Background is approached like an audit. The inquiry notes prior incidents involving the couple because they inform risk, not because they prove an outcome. Officers gather formal records and corroborated statements rather than rumor. Any past threats or controlling behavior, if documented, are entered as context and kept separate from the evidentiary spine that will have to stand in court. No body cases fail when investigators confuse history with proof. This team keeps the lanes distinct. As the alibis weighed, a practical checklist guides the work. Did fuel purchases match the miles claimed? Do delivery times align with the distance between stops? Do call records show contacts consistent with a normal business day? When 2 witnesses echo the same phrasing, interviewers split them and re-ask with different reference points. What they heard, not what they think they remember. Small time shifts matter. 5 minutes reclaimed from a route can reopen opportunity. There is also the question of preparation. Investigators look for signs anyone anticipated a sudden absence. Packed clothing, cash withdrawals, a bag set aside. None of that materializes. On the legal front, the bail status means court dates, solicitors, and obligations. Events that create their own paper trail. Those are checked for overlaps with the timeline. If an appointment existed, it either shrinks the window or it doesn't. The file, as of now, shows a mother with routine obligations and no credible plan to leave. Community interviews remain disciplined. Neighbors are asked about vehicles not normally seen on the street, contractors working nearby, or door-to-door services that might explain a stranger at the property. One rule controls the list. Name a person only if there's a legitimate reason they might have been there. This keeps speculation out and keeps the case from turning into a crowdsourced story. Rural cases tempt rumor. The team refuses to outsource its burden of proof. By day 9, the shift from concern to suspicion is complete, and the legal context is fully logged. A husband on bail, an alibi under examination, and a home with no decisive trace of a violent event. None of that answers the question that matters most. Where is Arlene? But it narrows how the answer could look. The data sits too neatly for comfort. Life rarely stops with that kind of symmetry. In towns like this, crimes don't just break laws. They unsettle routines that most families never have to think about. 2 children still expect a parent at pickup. A community still expects a reason. What elevates this phase is not a dramatic break, but discipline. The inquiry isolates opportunity with the fewest assumptions possible. Every claim minute must live somewhere, on a receipt, in a register, in a memory that doesn't change when the question is asked a different way. That is how a no-body case respects both sides of the ledger, a presumption of innocence for anyone named, and a presumption of urgency for the person who cannot speak for herself. The next development doesn't come from a search line or a phone ping. It comes from inside the house, and it arrives late enough to look deliberate. 9 days after Arlene disappears, personal items re-enter the narrative in a way that does not match how people leave their lives. That event will change the weight of the evidence and force investigators to treat the home not as a crime scene, but as a stage that someone tried to set. 9 days after the disappearance, the case takes a measurable turn. Items that should have left with Arlene Fraser, her rings, are suddenly back inside the house in Elgin Moray. This is not rumor. It's a documented event. Investigators treat it as a fresh evidentiary entry, not a conclusion. The question is narrow and practical. Who had lawful access to place them there? When exactly were they noticed? And why would these specific items reappear after more than a week of silence? The team re-enters the property with a focused brief. Establish the earliest reliable moment the rings could have been seen, and identify every person who had a key or supervised access to the home during those 9 days. Officers note which room they were found in, how they were positioned, and whether their placement matched normal storage habits. They check photographs from the initial welfare check, drawers, surfaces, jewelry stands, to determine whether the items were present and overlooked or absent and later returned. That timeline matters. If the rings were not there during the first pass and are there now, someone crossed the threshold and made a choice. Chain of access is locked down. Family, close friends, and anyone assisting with childcare or house duties are interviewed again with tighter timestamps. Detectives confirm whether the house was ever left unsecured or whether a neighbor or relative had temporary custody of a key. They ask a simple control question: who, beyond police, stepped inside the residence after day 1? If the list is short, the investigative load is manageable. If it's long, the case risks drift. Here, the list remains controlled. The rings themselves are documented and secured. Basic checks confirm they are Arlene's, consistent with what friends and relatives describe her wearing. Detectives evaluate whether their return aligns with a voluntary departure. People who plan to leave often take valuables or hide them with intention. They typically don't vanish and have rings reappear a week later in a way no one can explain. The reappearance reads as deliberate, but the team avoids labeling motive on contact. They log the fact pattern and move on to opportunity. Placement analysis is next. If the rings are found in a location that implies visibility, kitchen counter, bedside, or another obvious surface, that suggests the person who placed them wanted them to be noticed quickly. If they were tucked away, that suggests a different aim. In this case, the central issue isn't theatrical staging. It's whether the reappearance looks like a crafted narrative of "she walked out." The timing, 9 days, is hard to ignore. It's late enough to stand out, but early enough to steer public perception before the case fully hardens into suspected homicide. Investigators return to the alibi work already in motion. The reappearance forces a cross-check. During the 9-day window, where were the people with access at the times when the house was unoccupied by police? Delivery routes are compared against the narrow windows when the residence was between checks. Any claimed time away from work is logged. If a person could enter unseen and undisturbed, that possibility belongs in the file. Witness statements are handled with caution. The team asks who first noticed the rings, what prompted that person to look in that specific place, and whether anyone else was present. They collect immediate impressions, but prioritize facts that can survive court scrutiny: time, location, and access. Any changes in memory across retellings are recorded, not to trap someone, but to measure reliability. No body cases live and die on consistency. There's also the human side, managed with care. The return of personal items does not provide answers for 2 children who still need one parent to show up. The police avoid fueling speculation in the community. Public messaging is restrained. The inquiry continues. New information has been received. Additional interviews are underway. That restraint is not indifference. It is how you protect a case that might become entirely circumstantial. Internally, the rings shift the weight of competing theories. A voluntary walkout becomes less likely because the behavior does not match known patterns of people who decide to leave. For investigators, the reappearance is a controlled hinge. It allows them to ask harder questions about intent and coordination without declaring who is responsible. It also underlines a core rule of staging. Props are introduced to be seen. When you know what the prop is and when it appeared, you can confine the field to those who could carry it onto the set. Before the day ends, the team updates the evidence board. The 9-day marker is highlighted. Access windows are tightened. Intervals between police visits, family check-ins, and neighbor observations are aligned to see where an unaudited approach to the house could occur. The work isn't cinematic, it's incremental, but this is the first development that behaves like a deliberate act connected to Arlene's disappearance. The data aligns neatly again. Sometimes that's the problem. It can mean a plan. This moment sets up the next investigative thrust. Associates and vehicles that enter the record not because of gossip, but because their actions touch the timeline. One car in particular will draw attention and pressure test the emerging theory that someone managed both disappearance and perception. That won't be resolved here, but the line is now visible. The ring reappearance narrows theory. The next question is whether anyone beyond the household helped shape what happened after April 28, 1998. Detectives turn to people around Arlene Fraser and her husband and to a vehicle that keeps surfacing in notes, a beige Ford Fiesta. The aim is straightforward. Establish who did what, when, and why it mattered to the timeline. Investigators start with associates who moved in the same business and social orbit. Names are not added because the town talks. They are added because actions intersect with the case record. One associate, Hector Dick, becomes relevant through transactions and later court activity. Another, Glenn Lucas, appears in charging documents tied to attempts to pervert the course of justice. These are not conclusions about homicide. They are markers that people close to the center took steps that disrupted a clean investigation. In a nobody case, obstruction is not a side issue. It is often the first proof that coordination existed. Vehicle work is patient and dry, the kind of grind that moves cases without fanfare. The team pulls registration history on the beige Fiesta, runs ownership changes, and maps any sale or disposal that tracks to the post-disappearance window. They compare those dates to interviews, phone use, and travel claims. Even without modern telematics, old-fashioned triangulation does a lot. Witness sight lines, garage receipts, scraps of paper with dates and mileages. If a car is acquired, moved, or scrapped in a way that lines up with the investigation's pressure points, that's not noise. As interviews deepen, the story around the associates shifts. The police record, who speaks freely and who edits themselves mid-sentence. They note when a detail is volunteered and when it has to be pulled twice. In due course, court proceedings confirm what the inquiry suspected. Perverting the course of justice happened, and there are legal consequences for it. Hector Dick receives a 1-year custodial sentence on a related charge. For investigators, that outcome is not about punishing a side character. It's about proving there was active management of perception. The rings suggesting walkout, a vehicle possibly used for transport, and friends who helped tidy the edges. The beige Fiesta is kept in view because it offers something a statement can't, an object that either exists on a date or doesn't. Detectives examine whether it could have been used quickly for a narrow task and then moved out of circulation without fuss. They track yards, private lots, and paperwork that sometimes gets misplaced when people are in a hurry. None of that alone proves violence. Together, it supports an inference that means and movement were thought through. The inquiry also retests alibis through the vehicle lens. If a person claims to be fixed to a delivery route while a car of interest is on the move, can both be true. The team checks whether keys, storage locations, and quick handoffs could enable two actions at once, a public routine on one side and a private errand on the other. In circumstantial prosecutions, this is the work, removing coincidences until the coincidence can't stand the weight. Why does this matter beyond the courtroom? Because it shows the difference between a disappearance and a plan. People don't coordinate a staging prop 9 days in, move a car through hands and paperwork, and accept charges for obstructing an inquiry by accident. When communities hear nobody, they sometimes imagine there is no case. What the associates strand proves is that a case can stand on behavior: buying, moving, lying, correcting, pleading, each action measured against the same day in 1998. The team keeps the public line tight. There is no benefit in announcing every name and every theory. The record already contains enough friction: claims, denials, revisions. Officers update the board with what is certain, who acquired the beige Fiesta when that intersected with the disappearance window, who pled to obstruction, and how those facts tighten the circle of access. The investigation is still careful with labels. It doesn't declare the car the murder vehicle or any associate the key. It states what can be proved and lets the pattern do the rest. As this phase closes, the case has moved from a clean house and a silent phone to documented interference and a vehicle path that aligns with the most important date in the file. That shift sets up the prosecutorial spine that will appear later: a circumstantial case built on rings used as staging, associates who help shape the narrative, and movements that do not match a spontaneous walkout. The next step is formal: indictments. And with indictments, the story leaves interview rooms and enters a courtroom where every assumption must survive instructions to a jury. By spring 2002, the investigation is no longer a search. It is a case. Prosecutors file indictments that push the disappearance of Arlene Fraser into a courtroom in Scotland's High Court. The charge against Nat Fraser is murder, with others unknown, a phrasing that reflects what detectives have learned since day 9. The rings returning, the controlled access to the house, and conduct from associates that looks like coordination, not coincidence. Related allegations of attempting to pervert the course of justice sit around the case, but the center of gravity is a single question for a jury. Did a husband, with help or planning, remove a mother from her life on April 28, 1998? The Crown builds a circumstantial spine that is clear and teachable. First, the timeline tightens. Consistent routines up to the morning school run, then total shutoff. No verified sightings, no phone use, no banking. Second, the day 9 rings, reappearing inside the home, are presented as deliberate staging to sell a walkout that the rest of the record does not support. Third, the associates strand. Actions around a beige Ford Fiesta, later pleas, and admitted interference that undercut any claim this was a simple missing person. No single exhibit explains everything. The weight comes from how the pieces support each other without gaps. The defense plays the hand you would expect in a nobody trial. They press alibi claims tied to work routes and routine business calls. They question the reliability and motives of associates whose testimony or pleas touch the perimeter of the case. They remind jurors that no body has ever been found, and that without remains, cause and manner cannot be certified by a pathologist. In that environment, the job is to argue maybe. Maybe this is a voluntary absence. Maybe the rings were returned by someone else. Maybe a vehicle's timing is unlucky, not sinister. Inside the courtroom, the rules are strict. Jurors are told how to treat circumstantial evidence. It is not weaker than direct testimony if the circumstances taken together point to one conclusion and exclude reasonable alternatives. The Crown leans on that instruction. They show how voluntary disappearances look in records and how this one does not. They show how staged elements behave in other files and how these rings fit that pattern. They use the associate's conduct to argue that people don't risk charges to tidy a misunderstanding. Witnesses are heard and cross-examined. The defense highlights inconsistencies and plea incentives. The Crown emphasizes corroboration and timing. The vehicle strand is kept narrow and factual. Ownership, movement, and disposal mapped against the critical window after Arlene vanished. It's not labeled a smoking gun. It's presented as one more step that makes sense only if a plan existed. The Crown avoids overreach. The defense pushes hard on doubt. The judge reins in speculation on both sides. When the jury retires, what they carry back is not a confession or a forensic match. They carry a pattern, a mother who didn't break her own life, a home used to set a story, and people who acted in ways that supported that story. In January 2003, the verdict returns guilty. Life imprisonment is imposed with a punishment part set at 25 years. The minimum that must be served before parole can even be considered under Scottish practice. There is no promise of release at that mark. It is a threshold for review, nothing more. For families, a verdict is not closure. It is a line that the law recognizes. For investigators, a circumstantial conviction in a nobody case validates the method. Lock the timeline, prove access, expose staging, document coordination, and let the totality speak. But the story does not end here. Post-trial review will test whether every disclosure reached the defense. Years later, that question will matter more than anyone in this courtroom expects. Years after the 2003 verdict, the case leaves the facts of Elgin and enters the machinery of appellate law. The issue isn't whether Arlene Fraser vanished on April 28, 1998. That remains unchanged. The issue is whether the defense saw everything it was entitled to see before a jury sent Nat Fraser to prison for life. In 2011, the UK Supreme Court answers that question, and the answer resets the case. Non-disclosure sounds technical. It isn't small. In any serious prosecution, material that might assist the defense, whether it bolsters a line of cross-examination, weakens a witness, or adds context to a timeline, must be provided. The appellate record finds that certain material was not disclosed before trial. This isn't the High Court reweighing the witnesses or doubting the rings or rewriting the timeline. It is the Supreme Court saying the defense was not fully armed under Article 6 fair trial standards. When process is compromised, verdicts can't stand, even in a nobody murder. For families, this development lands hard. It does not declare innocence. It says the trial must be done again, with all parties seeing the same deck of cards. For investigators and prosecutors, it is a professional gut check. They built a circumstantial spine, timeline shutoff, day 9 rings as staging, and associate conduct that pointed to coordination. And a jury accepted it. But appellate law requires more than a persuasive pattern. It requires a process that is bulletproof. If one disclosure tile goes missing, the mosaic risks distortion. What changes now is posture, not facts. The conviction is quashed and the case is remitted for fresh proceedings. Evidence is re-audited for completeness. Disclosure schedules are rebuilt line by line. Witness lists are checked for anything that could affect credibility. If there are statements, notes, or reports that were previously overlooked or withheld, they're cataloged, assessed for relevance, and handed over. This is not a reheated replay. It's a disciplined reset designed to show the next jury everything the first jury should have had. The Crown prepares to try the same day again without overreach. They don't invent new scenes. They don't claim a body was found. They return to the durable points the appellate ruling did not disturb. A mother's life stops on a specific Tuesday. There is an unexplained return of her rings inside the home 9 days later. And people connected to the center engaged in conduct the courts have already treated as perverting the course of justice. The defense, now fully cited on the disclosure record, will attack from a stronger footing, testing witnesses, pressing alternatives, and challenging inferences drawn from staging and vehicle movement. From a human standpoint, the ruling underscores a hard truth about serious crime. Justice is not only about arriving at the right destination, it's about taking the right road to get there. Families want finality. Communities want certainty. The law demands integrity first. In towns like this, accountability has to survive the next court, not just the first one. By the end of 2011, all parties know what comes next. The first verdict is gone. The file is heavier with disclosure. The witnesses who matter will be asked to testify again. A new jury will be seated, and a circumstantial case, rebuilt on the same anchors, will be presented in full view. The question isn't whether to relive the story. It's whether telling it correctly changes the result. Arlene Fraser, 33, vanished from her home in Elgin Marais on April 28, 1998. Her routine stopped, her phone and finances went silent, and 9 days later her rings reappeared inside the house, an act investigators read as staging. Associates around the family were found to have interfered with the inquiry, and a beige Ford Fiesta moved through the timeline in ways that supported coordination. There was never a body. In 2003, a Scottish jury convicted Nat Fraser of murder. In 2011, the UK Supreme Court quashed that conviction for non-disclosure, not innocence, and sent the case back. The 2012 retrial put the same day in 1998 under full disclosure. The jury again returned guilty, majority. Sentence, life imprisonment with a 17-year punishment part, a minimum before parole can even be considered. In 2013, his appeal was refused. As of October 17, 2025, Arlene's remains have not been recovered. What endures is method and accountability. The case stood without remains because the parts fit. A fixed timeline, controlled access, deliberate staging, and proven obstruction. It is a reminder that justice is two things at once: the truth of what happened and the fairness of how we prove it. Families need both. If you take a lesson from Elgin, let it be this: when someone disappears, details matter. Who had access, what changed, what returned that should never have returned. Speak up early, document precisely, and protect the process. That vigilance is how a community honors a person who cannot speak for herself. I've told this story in the hope it does more than inform. It prepares us. In nobody cases, details save lives. Who had access? What changed? What suddenly reappeared? Justice is truth plus process. When we protect both, families keep faith with the system and with each other. What's your take? Should refusing to reveal a victim's location weigh heavier at parole? Did any moment here change how you'd act if someone vanished near you? If this episode moved you, drop a comment. Tell me where you're watching from or why it didn't work for you, and hit subscribe to follow the next case.